Good morning, Serrans. It's my great honor and privilege to introduce our next speaker. He doesn't really need an introduction. Bishop Tom Daly is the Bishop of Spokane, Washington. We are blessed to have him as our Episcopal advisor for U.S. Council of Serra. And I want to tell you that I think he is a courageous defender of our faith, which is what I think most of it. So with that, Bishop, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Before I begin, I do want to do a shout out to Susie and John Gorman for my ability to get out of the Midwest before the storms come, which haven't come yet. But again, John and Susie, thank you for taking me to the airport. When I did get to the airport with my flight that was originally to Seattle, it was Minneapolis, Seattle, I found out Seattle was delayed by 3 hours, which would have meant my connection. I would have not had the ability to get the last flight out of Seattle to Spokane. So miraculously, or through the intercession of our Blessed Mother, when I landed in Minneapolis, I saw on the board departure to Spokane. So I went to the Delta Club and made a flight and got an upgrade. And so I landed, rather than getting at 12:30 in the morning, I was able to land in Spokane at 8. Not quite as cold as St. Louis, but about 15 degrees outside. So anyway, I'm sitting in my dining room and I'm grateful. I apologize for having to leave you. I do enjoy the time with all of you, and it just so happens. So hopefully this snow that will come and no one will be have any problems with safety returning home. I been asked to speak on servant leadership, and before I begin, that term can be used, and it's used especially in church circles, and it can become the latest kind of flavor of the month. But I think if we keep focus on that term of being a leader and yet focusing on service, we're very much aligning ourselves with Christ. There are 3 passages from Scripture that I think are helpful. The first is from Matthew's Gospel, which is Matthew 23, 1-12. And you're familiar with that passage. I'll just read briefly, not all of it. Jesus spoke to the crowds and the disciples. The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore, do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to carry, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They will have places of honor, banquets, seats of honors in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces, and the salutation, Rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have one Father in heaven. Do not be called master. You have one Master, the Christ. The greatest among you must be your servant. For whoever him exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted. That's Matthew 23, 1-12. I always like that passage. I remember when I was president of Marin Catholic, we had the sports banquets. And so our football team had their banquet. It was at a hotel in Marin County. And I arrived a little bit late, and I looked up, and there on the upper table was the coach, the principal, the athletic directors, the assistant coaches. And I saw there was one spot. And I figured, well, of course, I'm president of the school. That's for me. And as I was about to begin the walk through the side aisle, and there were about 200 people there, a parent came up to me who I'd known and had a conversation with me. And I spoke a little bit, and I was beginning then the walk. And all of a sudden, someone comes from the back and sits in that one chair. It was one of the coaches. He had gone to the bathroom. So I thought, wouldn't that have been awkward if I had gone up expecting the place of honor and it wasn't there? Now, normally there was a spot, but it was kind of, I was saved from being humiliated from that moment. But that passage that Jesus is one of the so crucial foundational principles of leadership in the church about the role of humility, which I'll speak about a little later. There's a second passage that I think is very important, and that is Mark's chapter 10, 35-45. That is the ambition of James and John. You know that they want essentially they want the upgrade to first class. And Jesus is not going to tell them it's easy. It's interesting. Matthew, in his gospel, has their mother ask, almost as if it was too humiliating for the apostles themselves to be that self-serving. That's another passage about what Jesus basically says. If you want greatness, then it's going to involve sacrifice. And finally, a third passage for your reflection is from John, and that's John 10:11-18. That's about the good shepherd who's willing to lay down his life. Again, John 10:11-18. I choose these passages because I think they're very important to us on what is part of leadership, servant leadership in the church, especially as Serrans. As Serrans, you have a very, very important role in that you were called as lay people to foster a sense of holiness first in your own life, but in the parishes in which you are part of. And in that holiness, part of your mission, as we heard yesterday, is that encouragement, that prayer, that ability to keep a focus on religious and priestly vocations within your parish community. And that is a very, very important role. As you hear me say so often, Serra has never deviated from your mission. And that is so important. As a bishop, I'm very grateful to that. So some of, I think, the important things we learn for leadership with Jesus is the first thing is we lead by example. That's so important. Our actions speak louder than our words. The second is we have to always fight against our own ego, our desire for public greatness. The third is we don't draw attention to ourselves. Now, I know that can be difficult, especially so many Serrans have been successful in your professional careers, and there's been recognition of that. But in the church, there's enough self-promoters, as Jesus talks about the scribes and the Pharisees. I mean, honestly, ambition can be very rooted in so much of the clergy. And we see this in self-promoters. It's there, and it's there in the hierarchy. We have to accept it. It's sad, but it's present. So good leaders don't draw attention to themselves. The other thing is good leaders don't desire the fancy titles. Now, Jesus talks about them wanting to be called rabbi. It's amazing. I think in, wearing a collar, St. Louis, people seem to call you father, even at the airport. And that's not always the case. Now, Jesus is not saying the legitimate titles we have, but, people who like to have the business cards, if they have those anymore, but the names on their desks at work, the big titles. And a leader, a servant leader, does not let that be a focus of their life. And again, fundamentally, leadership is about responsibility and service. In the church, you'll have people who want to talk about, for example, ordination, as if ordination is all about power. No, ordination is about responsibility. And as a bishop, I remember, I may have told the story, when I was named a bishop as auxiliary bishop, Archbishop Niederauer and I met. He was the Archbishop of San Francisco, a great man. I learned so much from him. He's given me advice. And part of his advice was, you don't have to have all these skill sets. God will put in your life laymen and women who have the gifts that you don't have, especially in the area of finance, in planning, and they'll be inspired to help. Don't take them for granted, but know that they are there to serve. And I saw that when I was president of Marin Catholic. The men and women who were on our board of regents had gifts and talents and insight and professional skills that I did not have as the bishop or as the president. And I remember the chair of the board said, "Father, your role is to remind us why we're doing this. We'll help you in construction and planning and architecture and all that, and finance." So he said, again, God will put lay people in your life when you're called to be responsible. The second is you will have priests, even a few, who will help you in the mission of the gospel. And finally, he said it's going to be a tough job. Remember, 11 of the 12 were martyred, the apostles, and you're a successor of the apostles. So it's going to be difficult. And he was very true. As you heard me say, being a bishop is like a dad who works 2 jobs. No one's ever happy. And there's always a problem someday that one has to deal with. But yet we're called to that. So I say all of that is, with that background of those 3 scripture passages, which I would invite you to reflect on at some point, maybe while you're there in St. Louis or when you go back to your home. Also, I think servant leadership, connected to what I've often said, remember, humble people is so essential when you're doing the work of the Lord, to be humble, to see all that we have as grace. Of course, Paul says, why should we boast? All that we have, we've received. Vincent and Paul, remember his line about humility. Humility is truth, pride is a lie. So if you want to be a servant leader, first you have to be humble. The second is to be grateful. The older I get, the more grateful I am to the people who played a role in my life, beginning with my parents. I was one of 7, and my dad was an executive for a furniture company, and he had a great job. He always reminded me of kind of Atticus Finch, not a lawyer, but a furniture executive. But my mom and my dad made sacrifices for all 7 of us to go to Catholic schools, and then I look at the other people in my life, coaches and teachers, the priests, the sisters, the brothers, Christian brothers. All of them played a part. So humility leads to gratitude. To look at all the people who played a role in our life, who prayed us to this moment. And then humble, grateful people are generous. Again, you've heard me say this. I look at the priests that I've known over young priests that I've worked with when I was both a vocation director and a seminary rector, especially the ones I know in California. And the ones who are not happy in their priesthood, they're not generous. That's they are not generous. They have, they forget the principle of St. Vincent de Paul. Sometimes we have to leave God to meet God. So I have my prayer, okay, and my holy hour, 3 to 4. No, that's when the students in religious education are present, and you need to be there for that. Or someone calls, and you've heard me say this before, people don't get sick, they don't need help, and they don't die when it's convenient. You have to be able to respond. So generosity is so important. And then when one is humble, grateful, and generous, one has peace and joy. And how often do we have people, sorry for repeating this, but, if there's no joy in what we're doing, there's no humor, because the path to holiness comes from our humanity. I tell this to the seminarians. We are all men, and men were this short of failure. Look at the great figures from Scripture. What brought them down, or what knocked them in? Saul was jealousy. David was lust, and Peter was cowardice. We have to be very careful. So humanity, accept our humanity. Don't declare war, and accept it. Number 2, humility, which I told you is truth. Very important, what we have received, and a sense of humor. You can't go through life without a sense of humor. Don't take yourself so seriously. So that path to holiness is also part of servant leadership. And, if we don't have the joy, then we become, as the Italians say, remember the musalungo, the long face, but the Irish have the better phrase, the vomit face, okay? That doesn't lead people to Jesus Christ. So when we're humble servants, we're pursuing a path to holiness, which includes those 3, humanity, humility, and humor. There are other aspects, I think, of servant leadership that are important too. And the first, of course, is you have to pay attention to the people you work with, the rank and file. I remember reading when I was, I guess probably shortly before becoming president of Marin Catholic, that one of the corporate executives was hiring. Of course, this was in the early 2000s. And he would take the candidate they were thinking of hiring out to lunch, and he would watch how the candidate interacted with the wait staff. When someone put the salad down, thank you, whatever it is, versus the people who expect to be waited on. You probably heard in your time at Serrans, the flaw of many seminarians who become priests, and it's entitlement. I deserve this, and no sense of gratitude, no writing of thank you notes. And I think that executive who would watch how that candidate for the job interacted with the wait staff became a good indicator. Would this person be someone, when they put into a managerial position, cared about the people who worked with them, who worked for them? And the old line about, I think it was Loyola Medical School, where one of the exams of a professor in class was going on, of course, the technical aspect of biology. But the last question is, what's the name of the woman who opens the classroom when we come in? And not one of the students knew it. And he says, you have to pay attention to the rank and file. So servant leadership is about knowing the people who you work with and expressing gratitude for their service. Second key aspect is, in addition to paying attention to the rank and file, is that servant leaders think always for the good of the church, not selfishly, to think of the good of others. How will my actions and my decisions impact others? I know as a bishop and the assigning of priests, we have one situation here in my diocese that I had to remove a priest for misconduct, and there's still a criminal investigation going on. And unfortunately, there's a small core of people within the parish who don't believe what has been the recommendation of the review board and a private investigator and the police still with an ongoing investigation. But my question is, of course, in meeting with the personnel board, is what is best for this entire parish? So again, servant leaders think about the greater good. Just as you as parents and grandparents think of the greater good of your family, how does this decision that I'm going to make impact it? And how often do greater groups, a parish, a diocese, a Serra club, suffer because of decisions that were made by self-centered individuals? The greater good is so important. You've heard me talk about weak leadership in the church. I'm specifically talking about priests and bishops, and that comes, remember, from men who are afraid of bad press, afraid of an impact on the annual appeal. How will that play in the community? And so they don't make good decisions or courageous decisions. Or we have the guys who are the great compromisers. Sadly, within the bishops of the United States, we don't honor elected officials who attack life. That's a fundamental teaching of our faith, the belief in the dignity of the human person, the unborn, the aged, the infirm, the refugee. So we have the great compromisers. And then we have the individuals who don't believe. They don't believe that Jesus is a savior. They don't believe in the teachings of the church. So that leads to weak leadership. And I suppose at the heart of all of that is self-serving. I don't see that at times in the laity, especially in the Serrans, but you may, as lay people, observe this, and you may at times be very discouraged when we as shepherds don't lead courageously. So again, thinking of the common good is another key aspect of the servant leader. A third is back to humility, to strive for humility that invites the leader to see, if we're having problems, have I caused any of those problems? We talked about yesterday when I was present with you, looking at different clubs and those clubs that are being honored. And I think Anne was talking about the ones that have challenges and yet the ones that seem to be doing well. What is it? And is the person who's leading part of the problem? So there has to be always that humility to see if I'm part of what is holding us back. One of my classmates and great friends for almost 40 years as a priest, he was rector, and he said to me of the seminary, our friendship is not based upon the jobs that both of us have. If you think I'm not doing the job, you and the other bishops, let me know. I'll step aside. Our friendship is not based upon these titles. And I think he is a very good leader who's had health issues, but a very humble man. And I know his cousin, Maureen and Bob are there from Aaron's from St. Louis, Father Dan Dono, a great leader, but a humble man, a very gifted man. but one who always said that, okay, if I'm not doing what I should be, let me know. I think also humble servant leaders submit to accountability. They're willing to have discussions about what are we doing and bringing people together. At a time of a crisis, you need a leader, and that is someone who can step forward and with these qualities and move in a direction to lead us out of the difficulties. And think of all the great leaders of our country and within the church. I'm thinking of St. John Paul II. When he became elected, we all can remember that the church was in kind of a spiritual malaise in that time in 78. And had the church gone in that direction of chaos, we would not have, I believe, those great religious and priests and lay people who had the direction they need. John Paul, because I remember reading in one of his biographies of John Paul, why he was such a leader, because he saw the horrors of Nazism and communism. And therefore, he had the ability to keep focus on what it was of God. And, God is not in chaos. God is in order. And when we lead in the church, we don't create chaos. Now, we may create people who are not happy. And I know that as a bishop, there are sometimes people aren't happy with the decisions I make. And I remember one of the priests said to me, well, Bishop, you don't listen. No, I do listen. And I make a decision. You just don't like the decision. And you have to listen. One of the things I learned, I don't know how people feel about this, but the Catholic school system in the Archdiocese of San Francisco, the high schools owned by the Archdiocese, were unionized. The only unionized system west, I think, Philadelphia. Sitting through union negotiations was an experience of purgatory for me. And I went through 3 of them. And but I learned it actually prepared me how to deal with priests. You just can't fire people like you fire the air traffic controllers under President Reagan's time. You have to work with people. And that, I think, is part of what it means to be a leader. Someone says to me, Bishop, why don't you do this? And I tell guys, younger priests, I said, when you go into a parish, I don't like the song All Are Welcome or Go Make a Difference. But you don't blow the whole choir up because that's what they're singing. And I said, making decisions involves prudence. And prudence is an essential quality of servant leadership. Vincent de Paul, in so many of his writings, talked about when you make a decision. It was interesting because he lived in the 1600s. When you make a serious decision, consult with lawyers. Now, I thought, my God, this is not the bishops of the 2000s where, law firms are on retainer. But Vincent Paul said, you make a decision in prudence, you consult with people, especially when it affects others. And I think servant leadership is about that. You work with people. So I tell priests, look, I'm not going to remove anybody unless they do something immoral, they're dishonest, or they're heretic. Now, if they're going to do some other things, you'll work with them. So I think there is an element of servant leadership of being able to be patient. Now, in all of this, I think a crucial aspect, of course, in servant leadership is to remember those words of Jesus: deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. There has to be a sense of putting aside one's own desires and wishes and comfort for a greater good. For the longest time, I was 19 years at a school, and I would say 14 years of those years were difficult for various reasons. And I may have spoken this before. The first was to have an ex-nun teaching religion who was reading tarot cards in class, which should scandalize you as it did, and other crazy things that were going on. But eventually, the words of Father Jim Tarantino sadly passed away. He was the president when I was the teacher. And finally, I think in February of my first year, it was his second year, at breakfast, he said, we're going to have to pray these people out. And we began a monthly holy hour. It just started with a mustard seed of people, 7 people. We gathered in the school chapel. We had Eucharistic adoration. We prayed a rosary, and he gave a reflection on the Sunday that we reading, because he had come from saying the Sunday night mass at St. Anselm's Parish. And out of that, our prayers were answered. Holy Thursday, the head of the department announced she was leaving. Sadly, she went on to a girls' Catholic high school where heresy reigned. And then there were other along the way. But in the midst of all that difficulty, I always thought it was take up your cross and follow me. The notion that this was a cross. But it was only when I became an auxiliary bishop and was transferred to another diocese where I left my home diocese. I left my family. Now, it was close, but it wasn't the same. And I remember suddenly those words, I had skipped the first step. Deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. This the notion of self-denial, which is those of you of Irish background, your mothers would say, offer it up. You got cut from a team, offer it up. The girl you asked to the prom said no, offer it up. It was always offer it up. One of my sisters said to my mom, she said, sacrifice is not in my vocabulary. And my mom, without missing a beat, said, then salvation is not in your future. So I think that, the importance of sacrifice is so important. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. So you as Serrans, I think, with the desire for servant leaders, what I offer to you is the importance of reflecting on the scripture passages and keeping in mind, of course, the importance of humility, gratitude, generosity, and joy, and also those elements of Jesus. We lead by example. We have to fight our egos. Good leaders never draw attention to themselves. They don't seek fancy titles. And ultimately, it's about humble and generous and faithful service. So those are my words. I don't know if you have questions for me, but I'd be happy to answer what I can.
Bishop Daly, what's your feeling about breaking the seal of confession in a criminal investigation?
Yes, as you know, in Washington, we the Catholic governor who started this assault when he was the Attorney General pushed forward with this under the guise of it was done for the greater good of safety of victims of abuse. I was very clear from the beginning that we would go to jail rather than break the seal of confession. Historically, in the history of the world, there have been efforts to do this, and yet we remain firm. And, it's not really about protecting the abuse of children. The church has done remarkable in its protection in the last 20 years. This was just, I think, an assault on the Catholic Church. The difference is this year, under the President Trump's administration, the Justice Department supported us. And in fact, I think the assistant to the Attorney General is Harmon Dillon, and she came out and said, this is an anti-Catholic law. And it was defeated. But of course, in the state of Washington, much like California and other states, you can't be naive to think that they might come back for something else. So it's hold the line. And I think the lay people were especially grateful for the stance that we took. Yeah.
This is Kathy from Minnesota.
Okay.
The bishops have come out with a wonderful document and guideline for us, and it's called You Are Not Alone. Have you had a chance to go through that document? And it's to help us deal with, as Catholics, the immigration issues, and also supports of rosaries and prayers and peaceful things that we can do to support what's going on. Have you had any chance to see that?
No, I haven't. I know that Bishop Barron had written something from Winona, Rochester, about focusing on the criminal illegal, undocumented, and calling for a sense of calm against with the protesters. So we haven't had that much in the state of Washington, certainly in Spokane. I think when it comes to obviously this is very prominent in the media today. Immigration is complicated. I think there are people who are truly refugees who came here seeking a better life, seeking to escape, are productive. I think the American people are very supportive of that. However, I think the American people, the rank and file people, are not supportive of just open borders that led to criminals coming, and the people who I believe this is the latest protest to agitate. I'm really sad that Minnesota seems to be the ground zero of all of this, but I do think we have professional agitators who really don't care about immigrants, who are just using this as a way to cause trouble. And there needs to be, I think, as the bishops, honestly, there's some who I think will find any reason to be critical of this administration, and were not critical or vocal during the previous administration when we had what seemed to be dishonesty about what was going on at the border.
Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope everyone has a safe travel, and God bless, and hope to see you in the summertime.
He is a great example of servant leadership.
Yeah.
I'll tell you again, he is a great.
All right. God bless. Thank you.